Chapter 1, the human body. So as we go along, I'm going to be pulling content from the PowerPoints. I'll be highlighting, and then I'll be also using this space over here to kind of draw and write, and to kind of explain things a little bit more. So as we go, we're going to experiment with see if this formula works for these lectures. So Chapter 1, the human body. To start with AMP, basically what we're really going to go is through the foundation. And within the world of human anatomy and physiology, there are two complementary branches. And these two branches need to work together in order for the functioning of the whole body. So these are going to be the branches of anatomy and the branch of physiology. So yes, this is human anatomy and physiology, but it's also named that because these two complementary branches work side by side. So when we're talking about anatomy, it is going to be the structure of the parts of the body and their relationship to one another. So when we're actually looking at the anatomy side of this course, this is going to be the concrete part. This is going to be the what you are able to see and feel. The anatomy is the physical, what you're able to see and feel. The physiology is going to be slightly different. So the physiology is the study of the function and how it works. So rather than the what you can see and feel, the function is going to be the how everything is actually put together. So as we're looking at these two pieces, the main reason these are considered the complementary branches and the why the class is titled Human Anatomy and Physiology is there is something that is going to be called that we're going to get to in a minute, and that is going to be form will determine function. So how it is organized, why it is organized, will determine what it is able to do. So you can't have the physiology without having the anatomy in place. And so from a clinical perspective, the reason this class is a foundational course for anything clinical is that the anatomy and the physiology needs to be learned from the perspective of how it works, what the typical, what the normal, or the clinical normative presentation should look like. But then when you're presented with something in the field, working in the ER, clinical pathologist, speech therapist, whatever it is, the career path you're on, you're going to be presented with anatomy or physiology where the human body is not working in the way it should. So something's off, something's not where it should be. So this class is going to start with the foundation of what is the normal or the typical anatomy and the typical physiology. So if you think about a car is able to roll on wheels because those wheels are round. If the wheels were not round, if the wheels were square, the car wouldn't be able to roll. So it's the very basic foundation of the structure has to be the specific structure in order for it to be able to do its specific function. So as we go, you're going to be learning normal human anatomy and physiology and how these two parts work together. And then as we get into some of the later chapters, we're going to start looking at some of the disorders or diseases or how either the anatomy or the physiology kind of goes wrong. So we're going to spend some time talking about that after we've learned the typical how things should actually be put together. So within the topics of anatomy, we're going to talk about gross and microscopic anatomy. So remember, this is what you're able to see and feel. Gross anatomy does not mean disgusting. Gross is going to be the anatomy that you can see with the naked eye. You do not need a microscope. So these are actually going to be large, visible. You can see these with the naked eye. Whereas when we get to microscopic anatomy, the microscopic anatomy are things that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. You are going to need a microscope to be able to do those. So when we're looking at anatomy, we're going to start pretty much every section with either the gross, so we're going to look up from the outside to the large structure to the small structure, or we're going to look from the small structure to the large structure. So either way, we're going to do gross and microscopic a lot throughout this semester. Lab will go into more of the naming of those anatomy, gross and microscopic. We're going to talk through the just overall specifics related to a little bit more of the physiology. When you start, if you are also enrolled in lab, you'll notice that there are histology drawings that you have due. So a term that you just need to be familiar with is going to be histology. Woo. And when you hear the word histology, essentially what this is actually meaning is a histology is going to be tissues. So when we start talking about any kind of tissue or anything that you need to use a microscope to look at, it's going to be histology. It's at that level of anatomy. So the way we're going to kind of organize the class is going to be in these subdivisions right here. So as we go, we're going to look at the organ systems. These organ systems are going to be things that are working together from a global perspective, how the entire system works together. And then within each system, we're going to be focusing on the cellular and the molecular levels as we go throughout the body. Okay, so I briefly gave you an idea about this concept, but a big takeaway from this first chapter is going to be the complementary of structure and function. So this is what I was referring to, where you have to be able to have this concept understood to be able to really understand the why behind this course. So the complementary of structure and function, how these two actually work together. So like I said, the form, the what, essentially, will actually determine the how. So the wheels need to be round in order for them to roll. So function will always reflect the structure. So this is a big premise of this. You can determine that something is wrong. If the function is telling you something is wrong, then you know that the structure is something wrong. So this is a really big principle of complementary structure and function. We'll talk a lot about how these two relate, but these are terms you just need to know as we start going. Okay, so looking at 1.2. 1.2 starts the concepts for this chapter. So 1.2, the structural organization. So within the world of human anatomy and physiology, we are going to be talking about the human body, but this is actually going to kind of be similar to what you might have learned in another biology class. But think about it from the human biology standpoint. So with the structural organization, we are going to go from the simplest level to the most complex structure. So from the simplest level to the most complex. And essentially we are going to build upwards. So at the basic foundation of the structure, we're going to start with talking about the chemical level of the body. So chapter 2 is going to talk about ions, covalent bonds, protons, neutrons, electrons. We're going to first start with the chemical structure of the body. The next level that we're going to talk about is the cellular level. So this is going to be chapter 3. The cellular level is how the nucleus works, how the mitochondria works. You've put all of these chemicals together, and now you've got a cell. A cell will come together, and you are going to have a tissue. So a tissue is going to essentially be a group of similar cells. So we've now taken all of these guys and we have cells and cells and cells that are all going to be super similar. They come together and join and create a tissue. An example of this is going to be a cell. You'll have a cardiac cell or a heart cell that's going to be in your heart. You put a bunch of those cardiac muscle cells together and you're going to get a tissue, which is going to be the cardiac muscle tissue. And then when you have the next level of structural organization above tissue, you're going to have the organ level. And the organ level is going to be, it's a structure of at least 2 tissue types. structure of at least 2 tissue types. So basically, if we have this cardiac cell, like I talked about, and you put that cardiac cell together, you're going to get cardiac muscle tissue. And if you put that cardiac muscle tissue with nervous, you're going to get an organ, and the organ we're going to talk about in that example is going to be the heart. So you've added and you've built this structure from the simplest to the most complex. There's 2 more levels within the structural organization. After the organ level, you're then going to go to the organ system level. And the organ system level is going to build. And this is going to be organs that work together. So now we've taken these tissues of at least 2 different types, and we are putting these organs together, multiple organs together. But there's a caveat. These organs are going to work together for a common purpose. So as they are coming together and they are creating this global function, they're going to work together for a common purpose. An example of this organ system, you're going to have your heart up here in your organ. You've combined your cardiac muscle with your nerve fibers. You've got your heart organ. But then you're going to add in your vessels and your arteries and the blood itself. That creates an organ system. So that creates the cardiac system. So that's how this structure is going to build. And then the most complex structural level within the body is going to be the organismal level. And this is the global whole organism put together. And this is going to be all systems working together. So this is an example of our cardiac system that we just talked about, working with your integumentary system, which is your skin, working with your skeletal system, working with your muscular system. That creates the organism. The organism for us is the human body. So if you look at this PowerPoint slide right here, it will go through and speak to this. So we're going to start with the smallest, or actually let's rename that, not the smallest, but the simplest. And then it's going to build from the chemical level all the way to the cellular level, from the cellular level to the tissue level, from the tissue level to the organ level, from the organ level to the organ system level, and then at the very end, you are going to end up with the organismal level, which is, as a reminder, the most complex. So this is how the class is going to be organized. Chapter 1, we're going to focus on the chemical parts of the body. Chapter 2, we're going to focus on the chemical parts. Chapter 3, we're going to work on cellular level. Chapter 4, we're going to work on the tissue level, and we are not going to get to the first organ level until chapter 5, and that's when we're going to cover the first organ, essentially, in the organism and the organ system. These are put together until we get to chapter 5, and we're going to do the skin first. So we're going to spend the first half of this course kind of going back to the basics of science and doing atoms, molecules, water. I'm going to give you a heads up that chapter 2 and 3, the chemical level and the cellular level. This unit is a very heavy unit. And if you, chapter 1 is not so complicated. It's almost a little bit of just an overview. But chapter 2 and 3 are going to be very heavy concepts, because if you have not had a solid foundation in chemistry, you're going to get it, which is great for this course. However, you're going to get an overview of a very fast, in-depth perspective of chemistry. So just want you to be prepared. And if you're coming from a perspective where you haven't had a full background in biology and cellular structure and mitochondria, we're going to go nitty gritty, and we're going to do DNA replication, and we're going to do genetics. We're going to do plasma membrane, and we're going to do a lot of physics in chapter 3. So I just want to give you guys a heads up that chapters 2 and 3, where we are going to go through the chemical level and the cellular level, are incredibly important, because they lay this foundation in order to get to the part that we all like, which is how the actual organism and all the organs work together. But we're going to spend some time on some just nitty-gritty science. to get this foundational piece. So I just want to give you that heads up. The rest of these PowerPoint slides, I just embedded the whole thing, are showing how these build on each other. So we're going to move past this section of the hierarchy or the structural organization, and we're just going to kind of briefly talk through the requirements for life. So when we're talking about these requirements for life as necessary life functions, we are talking about how the organism, this top level right here, the organismal level, how the top organism level is able to actually sustain life. So how do we actually sustain life, and what do we need in order to sustain life? So these are our necessary life functions that you need to sustain life, and we're going to talk through these just as an overview. So it's a little bit more common sense, but I want you guys to know these are what we need to sustain life. So the first part is we're going to need down here the ability to maintain boundaries. And basically what that means to maintain boundaries is we need to keep the outside out and the inside in. Mainly because if you think about your entire structure as your organism level, you have to keep all of your fluids, all of your nutrients, all of your cells, all of your skeleton, your muscles, all of your blood inside, and you want to keep the external environment outside. So that's how our whole organism works. But then from a smaller perspective, on a teeny tiny little, so the skin will do that for us, but every single part of our cell is going to have a boundary as well. So that means at this lower level right here, this cellular level, we are going to still have some sort of boundary that keeps the outside out and the inside in. And then we're going to talk about how that works. Another thing that's necessary to maintain life is going to be movement. From a human body's perspective, from an A&P perspective, we are not stationary creatures. We need to be able to move. Not only does our body need to be able to move, so we've got the muscular system moving our body, but inside our body, we're also going to have things moving inside our organs. So we're going to have it on the outside as well, the large perspective and then the micro perspective. We have to be able to move things from point A to point B. So that's entirely important for maintaining life. These other ones, so sorry, y'all. Another one we have to have is movement responsiveness. So the third thing you have to have is going to be the ability to respond. And basically what responsiveness means is that you are able to sense changes in the environment and make an appropriate change. So you can sense some sort of change in your external or internal environment, and you are actually able to respond. So we're going to spend some time talking about this in regards to maintaining your temperature. But in order to maintain life, if something is happening inside our body, that's something that's not supposed to be happening, we have to understand that, and then we have to adjust. Just like if something is happening outside of our body, we still have to have the ability to pick up that stimuli and then respond appropriately. So we are essentially interactive with our environment. We are not stagnant. Another thing that you are going to need for maintaining life is going to be this digestion. Digestion is hopefully a little bit self-explanatory, but this is going to be breakdown. Specifically, breakdown of food. So with digestion, you are intaking some sort of food, some sort of nutrients, some sort of liquid into your body, and you are then going to follow through a process of breaking it down to get the nutrients out of that. So digestion, we do this on a small scale level in our cells where they are going to digest nutrients. And then you also do this on a large stuff when you guys eat dinner. You are digesting your nutrients and breaking it down. Okay, so there's 4 other necessary life functions. The 5th one is going to be metabolism. Your metabolism is going to be your ability to include or have any kind of state of change. So this is really going to be your chemical reactions. Like I said, we're going to spend chapter 2 talking about chemistry. It's a pretty heavy chapter. So metabolism is all the chemical reactions. We're either going to break things down or build things up. We have to create new or we have to get rid of. The other thing that we're going to need for necessary life functions is going to be excretion. So excretion is going to be getting rid of waste. There are things that we will have in our body that we will not need. And again, remember, this is on the organismal level. As a human, you will need to excrete wastes and excrete liquids that you do not need. But on a cellular level, we are also going to excrete things from our cells that we do not need. We're going to get rid of all of our waste. And then the last two up here are going to be reproduction and growth. So with reproduction, this is going to be essentially the ability to make more, to reproduce. We are not isolated creatures where once we've got one of us, we're able to replicate on our own and we can just kind of continue from there. With reproduction at the cellular level, we need to create more new cells if there's been injury or damage, or if the lifespan of a cell is short. But on an organismal level, we also then need to be able to create reproduction with offspring. So we need to be able to make more. And then the last thing that you're going to need is going to be growth. From a human perspective, we are born as somewhere between the range of 6 and 10 pounds. And then we do not stay that size. We grow, we increase in our size. The same thing is going to happen on a smaller structural level where all of the pieces inside of our body, on a cellular level, on a organ level, everything is going to increase and grow in size. So you have to have that because we do not stay the same size as when we are reproduced. So those are all of the basic necessary life functions that you're going to need to just kind of stay as a global working whole. Okay, so now looking at these black pictures and these outlines, this is going to be essentially just a list of all of the body's systems. This is just going to be essentially an overview of a list. So we're going to first have the integumentary system. This is going to be our skin. That's what we're going to cover first. And then this one right here, we have our skeletal, all of our bones. After our skeletal system, the skeletal system connects to your muscular system, and it has the ability to move your bones. And then you've got your nervous system, one of my favorites. This is my background. Nervous system is the communication that tells your body to do what it needs to do. And this is where we're going to end A&P 1. We're going to cover integumentary, skeletal, muscular, and nervous. But A&P 2 will continue, and you will cover the endocrine system, which is going to be the hormones and another way of communication through the blood. Then you're going to cover the cardiovascular, which is another biological system, the heart, the lungs, and how the heart and then how it connects to the lungs and how it pumps everything throughout the body. The other systems you're going to have are, you're going to have the lymphatic system. As an FYI, I'm just going to continue this list down here. GSU does not spend a lot of time on the lymphatic system. So you may not actually have a designated course in or chapter in A&P 2, but there's some information about the lymphatic system. It's connected to your immunity. Then you're going to cover your respiratory system, your breathing, and how that connects to your cardiovascular system. Then you're going to talk about your digestive system, being able to break down your nutrients and get rid of wastes, solid wastes. Then you're going to have your urinary system, which is the removal of liquid wastes. Then you're going to have a little bit of a breakdown because this is where it switches gears all of the systems we've talked about so far are the same, whereas this last two systems, there are two different branches. So within the reproductive system, there is the male and the female. They have different structures. Remember, structure determines function. So if they have different structures, they also have different functions. So reproductive as a whole will have two different categories. Okay, so to briefly just talk through these survival needs, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm not going to write these pieces out. But what you're looking at with these survival needs is this just kind of a background information on these are the things that you need to have as a human in order to stay alive, but not just you need to have them. You need to have them in very specific amounts in order to stay alive. Ooh, so sorry. So these are the things that the survival needs are going to have a very specific amount. Too much of it or too little of it is going to be harmful. So these guys right here, first you're going to have nutrients. Nutrients are going to be your carbohydrates, your proteins, your fats, your minerals, your vitamins. We're going to talk about this in chapter 2. So you need to have a certain level of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And if you don't have the correct amount, your physiology will go wonky and we'll have some issues. Same thing for oxygen. As we're all aware, oxygen is something that is required for you to be able to stay alive. Not only just getting oxygen, but having the correct amount and levels of oxygen, especially in this paradigm with COVID-19. This is a very common, more common place term that is used than in past seasons of teaching A&P. So oxygen is important, yes, but also having very specific levels of oxygen is important. Same thing goes for water. We know water is important to the body, but did you know that you can have too much of it? And also you can have not enough of it. So you need to maintain the specific level of the water within your body. The normal body temperature is the one I think that we're just most familiar with. In order to maintain your normal life, your survival, in the best optimum manner, you have a very specific body temperature that you need to stay within. So this body temperature is got it listed right here as 37 degrees Celsius, but it's also going to be 98.6 Fahrenheit is the normal body temperature that you need to maintain. We are all aware if you go too high, there's a whole lot of ramifications that can happen. If you go too low, there's a whole lot of ramifications that can happen. And then looking at, this is probably one that we're not super familiar with, atmospheric pressure. So there is a very specific level of atmospheric pressure that we need to be able to maintain. So this is why if you've ever gone to Denver or you've gone up to one of the tall mountains, there's different patterns and different depths of being able to breathe. Whereas if you go down to sea level, where it's a different atmospheric pressure, there's a different level of breathing. So we need to be able to maintain, this is why we can't breathe in space because it's a different atmospheric pressure, and why we can't breathe underwater because the pressure, as well as the liquid, is not appropriate for what we need. So there's just kind of some general thoughts on those. Okay, 1.4 is the biggest takeaway of this section. So when we're looking at 1.4, again, this is where I would spend most of your time when you're reviewing this content. We are looking at the concept of homeostasis. So within homeostasis, what we are looking at is that this is going to be the ability for your body to maintain. So we're going to write that down. The ability of the body to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. So it's a relatively stable internal environment. So your body needs to be able to keep its internal environment at the same conditions or at the same level. But the thing about homeostasis is, yes, it needs to be able to do this, but this needs to happen even with changes in the external environment. So this is basically saying that if your environment outside your body changes, your body does not react with it. You have the ability to find your stable state and keep it. This is a very, very, very dynamic state. And dynamic means it is always adjusting. It is always changing. It is dynamic. It is not stagnant. Homeostasis, the term actually means wisdom of the body. So it has the ability to understand and fix and change. So it's got some wisdom there. So that's kind of what it kind of means. So it is a dynamic state. It is not, that is a priority topic. It is not static. Okay, so looking at what this means to be a homeostatic control. This is an example. The one we're going to use the most is we're going to come down here and we're going to talk about this guy right here the most. So I'm going to run through these guys real quick. Within a homeostatic control mechanism, how do we actually keep this occurring? What is responsible for controlling our stable state? So the way this is going to work is it is going to involve 3 components. These components are first going to be the receptor. So this receptor right here is going to be the item that will monitor the environment. And as it monitors the environment, it will sense whatever has changed. And then what it does is it will send a message. And as it sends a message, this receptor is going to send that to the next level, and this is going to be the control center. So your receptor will pick up the change in your environment and it will send it to your control center. And the control center will have a set point. And that set point is going to be your normal. So this is going to be the normal level or range. And once this receptor determines that the environment has changed and it sends a message to the control center, this control center monitors it, realizes that the set point, it is not where it needs to be, it has changed. And what that will then do is that will send the a communication to the third part of the homeostatic control mechanism, which will be the effector. And the effector is essentially going to be the final output. This is going to be the response. So if we have picked up a change in our environment and our body knows in the control center that that's not normal, we need to go back to our set point, your effector will be the thing that will actually do the response. It will control the response. Okay, so now if we have this process and we have the receptor to the control center to the effector, this is essentially going to be a loop. So at this point, we've got receptor, control center, effector. If we have an effector and it has created a response, it is going to loop back up to the receptor, which is going to monitor the environment and sense the change. So this is a loop. This is otherwise known as a feedback cycle. So the effects, the effects feed back to the original response, or effects will feed back to the original stimulus. And it will decide whether or not it needs to change or not. So it is going to be a feedback cycle. The effects of this guy feed back all the way up to the top to the receptor. There are 2 types of feedback. The feedback that you can have is I'm going to zoom on over to the side so that way I can not get ahead of the PowerPoints. So when you have the feedback to the original stimulus, there are going to be 2 types of feedback. You can either have feedback that will reduce or stop the effect. So we've got this effector right here. It's going to do some sort of response. I can either stop it and turn it off, or I can enhance and I can keep going with the response. Essentially, it's not turn off or turn on. It's more so turn off or stay on. So when you feed back this response, the original and the receptor picks it up. It is either going to get the message that it is, oh, hey, we're going to stop because we're all good. Or, nope, we're going to keep going and we're just going to keep going with response. And essentially, we're going to do more of it. We're going to enhance it. So those are the two types of effect. These two types of effect have two different names. You can either stop or you can enhance. So the first type we're going to talk about is going to be called negative feedback. So let's zoom in for these guys right here. So negative feedback is important. So it follows this cycle that we just talked about, but it does it in such a way that it is a very cool process. So this is the most used feedback mechanism in the body. This is what we have more of in all of our bodily physiological processes. And what negative feedback does is, the reason it's called negative is because the effector, what it is responsible for doing, will actually shut down or reduce the original effect of this, or the original stimulus. So basically, with negative feedback, you are going to shut down the initial start. So basically, you're going to do the opposite of the stimulus. So negative feedback, you are going to do whatever is the opposite of the stimulus. We're going to break this down in depth using a couple examples. So examples that we're going to talk through is going to be the regulation of the body temperature, what happens when your temperature goes up, what happens when your temperature goes down. And another example is regulation of body glucose, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on that one. So it's the examples over here, but what we're going to do is we're going to spend some time on this negative feedback cycle. So I am going to come all the way down here and focus my attention on this one and on this one, since it gives me a little bit of room. So this is what is called a negative feedback cycle. And the example that we are going to use is body temperature. My tablet keeps moving, y'all. I apologize. So with this negative feedback cycle, the example we're going to use is body temperature. Now remember, we said at the very beginning, one of our survival needs is that we need to maintain our body temperature. So we need to maintain our temperature at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So how we're going to do that? We're going to follow this process of stimulus, receptor, input, output, response. So what we're doing is essentially going a step further on what we talked about earlier, which the three parts of a feedback cycle, if you remember, are going to be receptor, control center, effector. So all we're doing is we are going to break down these three pieces into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps. So this is our first process of the semester. So with a negative feedback cycle, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have our receptor. I'm going to draw it in the same, in a different way. So we're going to still have our receptor that is still going to feed our control center, and that is still going to feed our effector. But how do we do this? So first off, what's going to happen with our receptor is we're going to have a stimulus. And the stimulus is going to be, we are talking about body temperature, is going to be an increase in body temperature. So we are going above 98.6 degrees, an increase in body temperature. This is going to be picked up by a receptor. These receptors that pick this up are going to be cells in the skin. Specifically, temperature cells, or cells that are sensitive to temperature. They will pick this up in the skin. So you're going to have an increase in body temperature that is picked up by the receptor. That will send the communication to the control center. The control center is going to be our hypothalamus, which is going to be in our brain. And our hypothalamus knows that we need to be at 98.6. So we are now, let's say, at 100. If we are at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, our control center knows that we need to be at 98.6. So he's going to send the communication down to the effector. And the effector is going to be some structure in our body. And specifically right now, in this example, it will be our sweat glands. And what happens when your body temperature increases? You are actually going to have a response. And the response you will have is going to be sweat. So with the stimulus, you had an increase in body temperature, but your ultimate response is that you sweat. And if you sweat, what do you actually do? You cause a decrease in temperature. So if we look at this example right here, our original stimulus was an increase, but what is our response? A decrease. That is opposite. So this is a negative feedback cycle. You can do that exact same thing. So that is going to be this example right here. Another example of that is going to be what happens, I'm going to zoom over to the right. What happens if our stimulus is different? Does the same premise apply? So if our stimulus is not an increase in body temperature, but it is a decrease in the body's temperature, how does that change things? So looking at this, our stimulus over here is going to be a decrease in body temperature. That is going to send communication to the receptor. It is still going to be the cells of the skin who are doing it. Decrease in body temperature. Let's say we're going down to 95 degrees. And then after that, the skin receptors in the skin are going to send that communication to the control center. It's also going to be the hypothalamus, and we're also looking for 98.6 degrees. But remember, we are below. So if we are below 95, or we are below 98.6, our effector is going to turn on, and he is going to send a communication, but this is different. Instead of it being to the sweat glands, it is going to send communication to the skeletal muscle. And what the skeletal muscle is going to do is respond in a very specific way. So what happens if your body temperature drops really low if you're waiting outside for someone to come pick you up, for the bus to come, for the MARTA train? If your body drops to 95 degrees, what you will eventually have when you go through this negative feedback cycle is your skeletal muscles will start to shiver. And if you shiver, what you are doing is you are contracting your skeletal muscles rapidly. And when you are doing that, you are increasing your temperature. So even if we have a decrease as the original stimulus, our output, our effect is opposite. Our effect is going to be an increase in temperature. So that's this guy right here. So basically, with a negative feedback cycle, the body's temperature is a great example of it. You are creating the effect that is going to be opposite the original stimulus or the original output. So that is how this process will actually work. So that's a negative feedback cycle. What happens if we have the opposite direction? And so rather than the stimulus being different, it's going to be more of the same. So that is going to be positive feedback. So with positive feedback, right here, essentially what it is it is going to be the result or the response will enhance the original stimulus. So there will be more of it. So an example of a positive feedback cycle, I'm not going to talk through specifics for this, but if you have a perfect example for this is going to be clotting. So when you have a blood clot and you have something that tears in your vessel wall and you're going to have a release of blood, it actually continues through this process. You will have platelets come through your blood, will release chemicals. Those chemicals release more chemicals. Those chemicals release more chemicals. So this is a positive feedback loop. When you actually have this, there has to be an external motivation that makes it stop. So a great example that I like to do is not so much the clotting, but the example I like to do for positive feedback is going to be labor contractions. So with labor contractions, what is actually occurring is when labor begins, so when it is time for a baby to be born, labor will cause the release of a hormone. And that release of a hormone is going to be oxytocin. Oxytocin will cause labor contractions. It will cause more muscle to contract. Labor contractions cause the release of oxytocin. These continue. More hormone being released, more contraction, more contraction, more hormone. We are enhancing the original stimulus. You'll notice there is no out, there is no done. With this particular process, with positive feedback, there has to be something else. So with the example of contractions, the actual birth, where there's no more need for labor, will actually end the release of oxytocin. So there is another external process that will actually stop it. Otherwise, this process will continue. So that's positive feedback. So you can kind of understand the difference between the two. Negative feedback is the primary process our body uses. But we do have several positive feedback type cycles in our body. Okay, so that's the biggest chunk of what you need to know for 1.4 chapter 1. I'm going to briefly talk through 1.5 to the end of the chapter, but honestly, this is just going to be more so 1.5 and 1.6, but these are going to be just easy things for you guys to be able to do and review on your own. So 1.5 is going to start with anatomical position. So what we're doing here is we are switching gears completely. And for the rest of this chapter, AMP 1.5 and 1.6, essentially it is making sure that we are speaking the same language in regards to the body. So that way from now on, when we start talking about things, we're all speaking it from the same perspective. So it's kind of like a Spanish 101 class to make sure that we are all using the same foundational nouns, terms, directions. So anatomical position is going to be our standard reference point. So our standard reference point. If you ever look at a map, you know that north has to be pointing north for the whole map to make sense. So this is the same way. When we're talking about the body, we need to make sure that we're looking at the body the same way. So the standard anatomical position is listed here. It is upright. It is going to be this, my stick figure. I apologize, y'all. Art is not my forte, and sometimes you just got to do with stick figures. So standard anatomical position You are stand upright, hands and shoulders in alignment, legs straight, feet pointing forward. So toes are pointing forward, legs are straight, hips are square, shoulders are square, faces forward. The difference is your hands will be, this part will be your pinky, and then inside will be your, the outside will be your thumb, and the inside will be your pinky. So with what you are doing here, if you were to stand in a very natural, relaxed position, your hands or your arm would fall like this, and essentially you would just be seeing the side of your hand with your finger sticking out. That was a very bad drawing, so we're just going to erase that. But with anatomical position, you are standing with your palm out. So your arm will actually look one like this. So if this is going to be the middle of my body, my palm is out, I would stand up and actually do that. That means if this is my body right here, this part is going to be my pinky, and this part is my thumb. This position also applies if you are lying supine, which would be where your toes are pointing forward, your hands would be by your side, and you would be laying like this. Palms would be facing up. So that's the only difference with normal, relaxed, just standing position. So then we're going to also talk about some directional terms. And these directional terms are to make sure that we can describe body structures in relationship to another one. This is essentially reading a map. So we're going to go through these real quick on my non-stick drawings. So one thing I do want to give you a heads up on is as you're talking about speaking directional terms, as a reminder, we're learning how things relate to each other. Think about a map. If you have north, the opposite direction of north is south. If you have east, the opposite direction is west. So these anatomical terms actually are going to have opposite directions. So that's very important to note. So this first two go together. So you're going to have your cranial, otherwise known as superior. So essentially that is going to be toward the head. You're going up toward the head. The opposite of that is inferior, also called caudal, and that would be going down or below. So you can say that the head is superior, because it's up here, to the abdomen. The head is more up, whereas the feet are inferior to the head because they are more down. That makes sense? Another two that go together are going to be anterior and posterior. These are also called ventral and dorsal. So these two go together, anterior and posterior. So this is going to be anterior is toward the front of the body. Posterior or dorsal is towards the back. So another way to think about this, anterior is going to be belly side. Posterior or dorsal is going to be back side. So your nose is anterior to the back of your head. So it's more on the front side. Another set that go together are going to be medial and lateral. And this is going to be looking if you split the body directly down the middle. If you were to drop a plumb line directly down the body, medial is going to be toward that middle section. You're going in to the body. Lateral, you are not going, you are going the opposite direction. You're going away from that. You are going out or away from the middle. So this is if you drop something directly down the middle. So an example of this would be my nose, which would be right on the midline, is medial compared to my fingers, which are farther away. You can kind of see how that works. Another example is intermediate. We don't use that one a whole lot, so there's not going to be a lot of terms where that's used, but that's going to be the structures that are kind of in the middle, and it's a little bit more unclear about what's going on. Okay, there's a couple other structures that you need to know. These two go together, proximal and distal. So proximal is going to be anything that is near. Distal is going to be anything that's far. So if you, these are very bad examples, so I don't really like these guys, but if I were to draw a little stick figure right here, and I were to draw them with my hands out, again, I'm not an artist, y'all. When you look at this guy, essentially what you're saying is, if you were to look at your elbow right here, your hand is proximal to your elbow. Your hand is near. Your foot is far. So your foot is distal from your elbow. So it is farther away. They're very interesting, but as you go, you'll kind of understand how those two work. And then the last two are going to be superficial and deep. And these are referring to internal and external. So superficial, I like to pull out the great 2000s movie of Mean Girls, and we've got the plastics. They were all about the external. They were superficial. So with the superficial, it is going to be toward the surface. So your skin is superficial. Deep is going to be things that are more internal. This is going to be your bones are deep, whereas your skin is superficial. So we're doing a 3D direction inside the body. Okay, another kind of directional term is kind of just talking about the division of the body. So we have North and South America. When you look at a map, you're going to have axial and appendicular parts of the body. So it's just like thinking through a map. We're all speaking the same language, but we're going to talk about the regional divisions of the body. But I'm going to move that guy back in place first. Okay, so the two major divisions of the body are going to be axial and appendicular. Essentially, this is North and South America. Axial is going to be anything that is going to be on the midline. So that will be your head, your neck, and your trunk. Axial. Whereas appendicular is going to be anything that is attached. So that will be your arms and your legs. That's appendicular. So it's essentially what's on the midline is axial, what's attached to it is appendicular. We talk about this mainly when we start talking about the skeleton system, and we're going to do the skeletal system by axial versus appendicular. Okay, I'm not going to go through these guys in detail, but you need to go through and review all of these. So this is essentially what I was saying when we're all learning how to speak Spanish, is we're all learning to speak the same language about the human body. So this is going to be the front right here. This is going to be the back. And these are all terms. From now on, we're going to use these terms or these nouns when we are talking about the actual anatomy itself. So for example, when we start talking about the neck, we're going to call it the cervical region. So if I throw out the cervical region, you need to remember that the term I am using is the anatomical term, so you need to have these memorized. Also, keep in mind that the human body is a three-dimensional object. So yes, we have the cervical on the back, but we also have cervical on the front because you are a 3D object. So just keep in mind, these are honestly super explanatory. Some of them you already know, like the abdominal region is called umbilical. You know, that makes sense. Some of them you might not know. So just, you are responsible for knowing those. That's going to be on your own terms, but it's just the front and the back. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to cover is going to be the body planes. So when we're doing the body planes, what we are looking at is if we were to take our body that looks like this, how are we actually viewing our body and how are we able to perceive it? So this is going to be body planes if we cut the body into sections. So this would be like saying we've got North America, South America. We've talked about axial and epidicular. This is like taking North America and doing Canada versus the East Coast versus the West Coast, where we're taking the body planes and cutting it up into sections. So these are the ones that you are going to need to know. And this is where you need to kind of just a visual, that's going to be the best one to kind of see. So the first body plane is going to be the sagittal. And the sagittal will split the body into right and left parts. So that means if we take my little stick figure dude here, you are chopping him right here. And if you chop him right here, you are going to have a right side and you are going to have a left side. So you've cut him in half. If you do it right down the middle, where he has an eye on either side and he is perfectly symmetrical, you have done the mid-sagittal. So with the sagittal plane, that is going to be this guy right here. You are cutting it essentially down the middle of the body, in between your eyes is a good way to say it. You're going to get a right and a left part. The next one is going to be the frontal. The frontal section, essentially what you're going to do is if I were to draw my little guy like this, whereas he's not facing forward, but he's facing the side, a frontal section is where you are actually chopping this way. I like to call this a headband. So if you were to put on a headband and you were essentially slicing down that headband, you are going from the top of the head down to the ears. You are slicing down the side of the body. What happens with a frontal section is you are going to get an anterior or a front and a posterior part. So you're going to get a front anterior and a back, a posterior section. So that's a frontal slice. That's this guy right here. And then the third one is going to be the transverse. And he's the easiest. The transverse section, So the transverse section for this, is, like I said, it's going to be the easiest. And with this one, what you're doing, here's my little guy. He's facing forward again. And with this one, you are going to slice across the body. So like a belt. So a transverse section is going to be kind of like a belt. And what you're doing with this one is you are going to have a superior and inferior part. So essentially you're going to have a superior, a top, or a bottom when you cut this in half. So the sagittal is going to split down the middle and create a right and a left. The frontal is going to split down essentially the side of the body and create a front and a back. And the transverse is going to cut down the middle of the body like a belt and create a top and a bottom. The reason these are important is within your book or your PowerPoints, you can see how these are going to be anatomical images from MRIs. This right here is from the perspective of where they have split someone down the middle, and you're actually looking, this right here is the spinal cord. This would be the front, or the, oh, so sorry. You are only looking into the right side of the body. This is the frontal section, so this is actually going to be where the head would be. This is the shoulders, and so this is the heart and the lungs. So you're looking, essentially, you've cut down like that headband, and you're getting half of the torso. And then this is going to be right across, right below your stomach. So this is your backbone right here. Think about this as a tube going into the screen. And then the tips of the toes are all the way at the very, very, very bottom. So this is right underneath the stomach, right underneath your rib cage, if you were to slice your body in half right here. So you can actually use these when you're looking at imaging scans. So for this last part of the section, that was 1.5. What I want you guys to do for 1.6 is I'm going to talk through the two pieces that I really want you guys to be familiar with. So this next part of the PowerPoint will go into something called body cavities and membranes. And essentially what I want you to just be familiar with, understanding that there are going to be different parts of your body that are going to be packaged together. These are called cavities. So you can look right here. You have a dorsal body cavity, and that is essentially going to be the part of the back of the body. And there are two parts of the dorsal cavity. You will have the cranium and you will have the ventral. This is your dorsal. And then another body cavity you're going to have is the ventral. So this is the front. And you will have the abdominopelvic and the thoracic. So basically, if you look at this guy right here, he's just the best to look at. You can see that all of these are individual little sections. That is all we mean by the body cavities. So I just want you to be familiar with how the body is broken up and essentially into different, packaged into different areas. And then the last thing I want you guys to know is going to be these quadrants. So I do want you to know the abdominal quadrants. And basically all that means is if you take the human body and you're looking straight on, your belly button is about right here. You are going to have these 4 quadrants right here. And these are named for anatomical position. So keep in mind, if you were to identify your right hand is going to be a different side than the anatomical position. So the right hand on our body is going to be over here, and our left hand is going to be over here. So if you look down at figure 11.1, this is the right side of him. This is the left side. So anatomical position in human anatomy is always going to be doing it from the other person's body positioning. So it's not your right and left, it is their right and left. So these are the quadrants. There are 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom. So you have the right upper quadrant and the left upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. These are important because if someone comes into an ER with a gunshot wound in the left upper quadrant, you need to make sure that you are not checking out that area. So it gives you a direction of within the abdomen where you should look. It also gives you an idea of organs. However, this is still a lot of body coverings to follow. So within the ventral body cavity, it goes a step further, and it doesn't just do the quadrants, it does the regions. So these are going to be the abdominopelvic regions. I do not think I spelled that right. So what this is doing is this is taking essentially the same square footage of your body. So your belly button is right there, and it is splitting it into 9, or it is splitting it into a hashtag type symbol. So if what I want you guys to know is go through and have identify these 9 areas. It follows the same pattern with this is the right side and this is the left side of the body. But what I want you to be able to identify is you do need to know these 9. That covers lecture and lab. But what I want you guys to be able to do is identify what these are, because as you'll notice, if the body is split into these 9 sections, right here, your stomach is only going to be found in the regions that are these 2 regions up top. That's important for anything clinical. So your stomach is actually going to be up here. Your urinary bladder will be down here. That is in a different quadrant. So it helps to speak to the locations of structures because you can isolate where the actual structure are. So if you have ever had or have ever known someone who has issues with their appendix, the appendix actually is found in your right iliac region. It's right over top your right hip. It's found in your right iliac region. But most people complain about pain in their left hypochondriac or their left lumbar region. So it's actually, when you hear pain up here, a lot of times the diagnosis ends up being down here. So you can actually use these terms to describe these areas and describe location of pain as well. So that is the end of this content. Again, keep in mind, this is an overview. Please go back through and be familiar with everything, know what's going on. But I hope this gives you an idea of the overall takeaways for what is needed for the content and for this course. For lab, what you need to go through, and you do need to be able to complete these exercises through your lab manual to be able to understand and identify more of the hands-on perspective of these pieces. So those are listed on iCollege for you to go through and look at. I believe it is Activity 1, Activity 2. We are not doing Activity 3. So it's Activity 1, Activity 2, I believe it's Activity 4, and Activity 5. But 1, 2, and 4 are the primary ones for you to focus on for lab.